After I left Sugarman, I was hired by the Mass State Lottery Commission, and I was their employment counsel and their director of human resources. So working for the state, that was a whole nother kind of job, a different skill, which was using cannabis and using cannabis as a medicine. And so ever since I was in college, cannabis had always been my preference to alcohol. I realized very early, in my opinion, and honestly in scientific opinion, it's a lot safer than alcohol. And alcohol was just never something that kind of sat well with me personally, just physiologically. I always looked to cannabis. But after my son was born, my son is 16 years old now, so he was born when I was in college, I got an ovarian cyst. And it was very painful, there was a lot of inflammation with it, and at the time my doctors told me that they wanted me to take very high levels of acetaminophen and along with some other painkillers. And at that time I was in my early 20s, and I thought, you know what, I don't want to take something that's going to damage my liver long term. And I was actually right about that, because just a month ago there was a big study that came out that showed that Tylenol, acetaminophen, was a leading factor in 1 out of every 3 liver failures in the United States. And so that was a legitimate concern then. And overall, at that point, there was no medical marijuana in Massachusetts, but I knew that people out in California were using this as a medicine. And I thought, you know what? I'm a pretty smart cookie. I can probably figure out how to make, some cannabis medicine on my own. And I started making medicine and making topicals and edibles and tinctures and all of this other stuff. And I was always very frustrated by the fact that there was no way to really know what your dose was. And I was taking all this very expensive medicine and kind of dumping it into a crock pot or putting it in an oven, and there was really no way to quantify what was happening there. So fast forward, a decade, and medical marijuana comes to Massachusetts in 2012. I ended up taking my medicine to the laboratory and testing that medicine, and what do you know, even after being an expert for over 10 years, I was still wasting about 1/3 of it. And I just embarked on doing a whole bunch of research on that process. It's an underlying process of decarboxylation, and through that research I ended up developing my company and a device, a decarboxylator, that really helps people go from plant to medicine in one step. It takes all of that science and distills it into one device that allows people to save a bunch of money and also know and be able to make any cannabis product that they want. So at that time, while I was developing my product and medical marijuana was getting instilled and implemented here in Massachusetts, I really had a front row seat to everything that was going on the medical side. All of the good things, which there were a couple, and all the bad things, which there were a lot. And so from that viewpoint of medical, and we'll get deeper into what the problems were with medical, but I really saw that there was a need for a change, and also that the medical system and even decriminalization, which we saw before medical, was not actually protecting people when it came down to protecting their rights. I was invited to help write the legalization initiative that just passed. So I was part of the group, and I was really proud to be part of that group, and we worked for over a year to draft the initiative, to collect the signatures, and to get it on the ballot. And as you guys are probably aware, it was a really tough fight to pass legalization, but thanks to all of the support, I'm assuming, of everybody in this room, we were actually able to make that happen. So I really want to thank you all for being supportive there. And now here we are at the precipice of this new industry, and there were a lot of things that we did during that process of drafting that were particular to trying to fix some of the problems, not only with the medical program, but problems that have been going back now for hundreds of years when it comes to people of color being targeted. But in the 1930s and the early 1900s, things really started to change. You started to see an influx of Mexican immigrants into the United States. You also started to see at this point things like jazz and other kind of black cultural items kind of come onto the scene. And more than that, you saw people of color starting and thinking about asserting, things like civil rights. And that was not sitting well with the powers that be. And you had this gentleman here, Henry Anslinger, who really was the architect of Prohibition from the very beginning. And back in the 1930s, and this was right after Prohibition of alcohol ended, and that's not a coincidence. So after alcohol prohibition ended, you had all of these federal agents who no longer had a job. They were enforcing alcohol. Alcohol was no longer legal, but guess what? There was a force and people that they wanted to control, and again, those were Mexican and blacks. And this is just a quote I'll read very quickly, which was Henry Anslinger, who actually was the first head of the agency that's now known as the DEA. And he said, this is real stuff that was going on, that was the background and the basis. So it's just really important to understand this because, for example, I was on a radio show the other day with a conservative talk show radio host down in DC. And when I was talking to him and mentioned the racist underpinnings of cannabis prohibition, you could have knocked him over with a feather, like he never had heard of anything like this before. And it's really important for people to understand that our drug laws, especially the drug laws around marijuana, were really intended and did have the effect of harming our communities, and that really was the intent from the beginning. Before the 1930s, cannabis was actually legal in the United States and in the rest of the world. It was used in China and India, and an American doctor discovered its use in India and brought it back to the Americas in the 1600s. And if you're looking at American pharmacopoeia back in the 1850s, cannabis and cannabis extract was used and recommended as a treatment and prescription for over 100 different illnesses and ailments. So it really was a part of the fabric of our medical community and society. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S. Now this was actually from his testimony to the U.S. Congress in 1937 in support of this new act, which was the Marijuana Tax Act, which would make marijuana illegal. He said that there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S. Most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. This is real stuff that was going on, that was the background and the basis. So it's just really important to understand this because, for example, I was on a radio show the other day with a conservative talk show radio host down in DC. And when I was talking to him and mentioned the racist underpinnings of cannabis prohibition, you could have knocked him over with a feather, like he never had heard of anything like this before. And it's really important for people to understand that our drug laws, especially the drug laws around marijuana, were really intended and did have the effect of harming our communities, and that really was the intent from the beginning. So in 1937, cannabis became illegal for the first time, and really then there began the reefer madness and disenfranchisement of people of color based on these new laws. So then there was another opportunity back in the 70s where people were starting to say, hey, listen, cannabis shouldn't be illegal, and it looked like there was actually going to be a change to cannabis laws. And Nixon, instead of actually listening to the groups that were telling him, even within the government, that this should be changed, perpetuated this racist war on drugs. And there actually have been advisors of his that came out within the last decade that said, yes, they were targeting counterculture, hippies, people who were against the war, and also people of color and black people. And that they couldn't come out right and say that, but they could make laws that then had the effect of incarcerating these people. And you can look at how very successful this policy was. Black and white people use cannabis at the same rate, yet 80% of people who are arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned for violations of the Controlled Substances Act, which is what came into place in 1970, are people of color. Arrest and incarceration numbers should be the same, where all of this harm falls squarely upon our communities. So now we have a system now that has been sustained for nearly 100 years. So you can imagine what kind of impact and what kind of far-reaching damage this has had, not only to our communities, the people who have actually been in jail over these violations, but their family members, the opportunities that are then taken from them even after a conviction, when you're thinking about things like Corbies and other collateral damage of incarceration. So back in 2008, some of you may remember this, 63% of voters voted for question 2. And what it did was it decriminalized possession for a certain amount, which was less than an ounce. The problem is decriminalization is not legalization at all, and it's really important to remember that. It did reduce arrests by 85% overall, but the problem was there was still a huge disparity when it came to how decriminalization was being implemented. So under decriminalization, what was supposed to happen is if you had less than an ounce of cannabis, you would get a $100 fine and they would take your material. If you were under 18, you had to go to a class or it would be a $1,000 fine. And in theory, this is good. The problem was the discretion was not being used in favor of people of color. So if you were white and you were caught, you would get a ticket. If you were black and you were caught, if you were lucky, you would get a ticket. But many other times you would get arrested. Other times you would get upcharged. So there was a particular case that happened, which was Umberto H. So this was a young man back in 2010. He arrived to high school and he smelled like cannabis, and they went and searched him, and what they found was the equivalent of 5 joints of cannabis. So 5 very small bags. In fact, when they wrote the police report, they said the street value of this cannabis was $0 because it was not a lot. But instead of giving Umberto a fine or making him go to the class, not only did they arrest him, but they charged him with possession with intent to distribute, which is a crime way beyond possession, which means you're selling cannabis. And the judge in juvenile court, it was actually one of our own, Judge Leslie Harris, dismissed the case because it was obviously ridiculous. Well, the state was so intent, the police in the state were so intent on prosecuting this young man that they brought this case all the way up to the Supreme Judicial Court here in Massachusetts, where the court did decide that the judge underlying did have the authority to dismiss. But this here, Umberto H., is a great example of why decriminalization was not legalization, did not protect people of color, and really was only the first step in this legalization journey for us. So the next step was medical marijuana in 2012. So this time we still had a large majority, but a little bit less. 60% of voters in Mass voted for question 3. So this law became effective in 2013. It was passed in 2012, became effective in 2013. And basically it creates this structure whereby physicians, patients who have gotten a recommendation from their doctor, and caregivers and also dispensaries are able to have some kind of interaction with cannabis relating to medical marijuana. And really the way that the system was structured was it allowed patients to buy from a dispensary up to 10 ounces of cannabis in a 60-day period. And it also allowed for patients to grow a small number of plants in their home. And the Department of Public Health is the agency that oversees this medical program here in Massachusetts. So when the law was drafted, there was an idea that there would be dispensaries that people could go to, and then there could be caregivers that people could go to. When the regulations were promulgated, however, basically Department of Public Health said that a caregiver could only serve 1 patient. Registry for patients. So DPH also required that every patient who got a medical recommendation register. And that caused a big problem for patients and honestly caused a lot of people not to get a medical recommendation. And when you're making that kind of restriction, is you're taking that racism and inequality that existed in the Prohibition and then just transferring that over to the new legal system. And so you had many people that were very qualified that were not able to move forward. Another huge problem was the licensing fees, the application fees and the requirements in order to get a dispensary. So the application fee, which was a non-refundable fee that you did not get back if you didn't get a license, was $30,000 just to apply for a medical dispensary. What kind of people do you know that have $30,000 just to put down for an application? It really sets the scene for only very, very well capitalized, very large businesses to move into the space. Another piece of that was what's called vertical integration. So unlike in Colorado, where you have a cultivator and then you have a retail license and then you also have a processor. In Massachusetts, when it comes to medical, all of the licenses are in one. So when you apply to have a medical facility, you have to be able to grow and to process and to sell. Again, that requires huge outlay of capital, a huge expense, and really only lets those players that are very, very sophisticated get into the market. Not only that, but you needed $500,000 in liquid assets just sitting in the bank in order to apply. And so that whole process that actually was supposed to yield 35 dispensaries in the first year, we're now 4 years out, and there are 9 open dispensaries. There are also, actually might be 10 now, I think one just opened in this last week. There are 80, more than 80, I believe the number's 87 right now, groups that have received provisional licenses. Only about half of those will actually become dispensaries, because what happens is after you apply to the state and they give you your provisional approval, then you have to go and find someplace, a city or a town, to site your dispensary. And what's been happening with these provisional applicants is that they're getting their provisional license from the state, but they're not able to find a place, a town, a city that will let them open up. So that's been a huge problem, even on the medical side, because many of the towns and cities and towns, as you may know, have either voted not to allow medical marijuana to come, or they've restricted it only to 1 or 2 places. So when it comes down to, so that's this piece of licensing and regulation. And I meant to mention this in the beginning, but when we're talking about cannabis legalization, we're always talking about 2 different pieces. There's always the social justice and the civil rights piece, which is the arrests and the prosecution of people of color. And then there's also the business opportunity piece. And they always go hand in hand, and you'll kind of see how that happens and how they go hand in hand as we're moving forward. So on the business side, the medical industry did not lead to any kind of equity or any kind of diversity, because out of these 9 dispensaries that are open, or these 80 that are waiting, not one of them is owned by a minority. And so I think it's crushing and very frustrating, and honestly there's not much we can do right now to go back and change what has been done on the medical side. What we saw, excuse me, I'm counsel to the Mass Patient Advocacy Alliance, which is the main group kind of in charge of protecting patients on this issue. And what we see is that we have more patients of color who are arrested and charged, even for growing at home. You see a higher percentage. And also what you see is that our communities aren't taking advantage of the medical benefits of cannabis. It's either we're not having access, or we're not having the education within the community about how this plant can be very helpful for a lot of different illnesses and diseases. And when we're talking about the benefits of cannabis, we're talking about things like diabetes and chronic pain and lupus and arthritis and all of these other things. And we're talking about a medicine and a treatment that is very economical, that when you're preparing it and you're doing it right is costing less than $1 per treatment. So there's a huge opportunity for us, our communities, to get stronger and get healthier if we have this information and we have access and we have a way for us to treat. Here's just a picture that I put of some of my friends in California who are in the cannabis industry, and this is kind of my dream for what we can do here in Massachusetts. This is Amber and Sunshine. They're cannabis activists really pushing for equity in Oakland. They were able to push in Oakland, every 3rd license will be given to somebody who has actually been in jail for a cannabis conviction. They also have a huge diversity push in Oakland. Amber suffers from lupus, and the state of California actually has just today recognized May as Lupus Awareness Day. And so my friends were actually up. If you could see it clearly, it says that right in the back, and they were on the Senate floor in California. And I guess my point here is that it really goes beyond kind of advocating for cannabis. It really goes to advocating for health in our communities. When you look at a disease like lupus, first of all, 90% of people that have lupus are female. And when you look at lupus, 80% of people who have lupus are people of color. So we have some diseases that are really, illnesses that are really only within our communities that we have the ability to treat, and cannabis has been shown to be excellent in treating lupus, and we have that opportunity here to start bringing those health benefits back to our community. But when we were thinking about writing the adult use law, there were really big concerns we thought about moving towards legalization. Number one was that disparate arrests after legalization, the fact that yes, it's decriminalized and yes, medical is allowed, but you still have patients of color that are being being targeted and you're still having that upcharging going on. Then ensuring equity and ownership and opportunity in light of medical here, like we just saw, where nobody of color has a license, and even Colorado, because after Colorado legalized fully for adult use, out of 500 dispensaries that were in Denver, only one was owned by a person of color. So you still had this big problem even after legalization. One of the pieces and problems there was that they took that no felonies and put it right into the adult use. And so that was a kind of a big red flag of how do we kind of avoid, now that we've seen this happen in other places, how do we try to take the best of what they've done and how do we improve where they failed? And the other thing was creating a law that actually allowed for small businesses and local people to participate, because that's not what we saw in medical. And it was really clear by the time we were writing legalization how DPH had failed us on the medical side. Okay, so social justice became a huge focus during the drafting. And we started internally pushing. When I say we, it was me and one other attorney of color that were on the group of drafting. Okay, so there's 16 people altogether, and only two non-white people. And so Shanel, Title is her name, and she and I really banded together to try to bring these issues of social justice to the forefront and make sure that not only that the community knew and that we were getting input when we were pushing towards these things. So a really important map, if you look at this map, this is the map of Boston, and this is where marijuana incidents have happened since 2015. And you can see it's color-coded based on population. You can see the blue areas are where white neighborhoods are. And you can see, if you can actually see the green neighborhoods, because there's so many red dots over them, underneath all the red dots is where the people of color live in the green areas. And you can see the red dots are where marijuana incidents have happened, and you can see how concentrated they are in the city of Boston, where people of color live. And the ACLU put this information together, and it really became a point that was important during the initiative, and we used these instances. I personally got up and started talking about my story of being arrested in Sharon after decriminalization for having less than the decriminalized amount, and if that was happening to me, an attorney in the suburbs, like what do you think were happening to young people, young men in the city? And really started focusing on the idea of economic opportunity and making sure that as we moved cannabis here into Massachusetts, that it was giving back to our community. So we were able to get that provision within the initiative, and then came the campaign where we pushed for question 4. Two very specific provisions within the initiative in the law that you can actually go and look at in the law right now that we were able to get in. The first piece was around convictions, like I mentioned before. So in our law, it actually says that you cannot be excluded from having a license if you have a prior cannabis conviction, unless that conviction was to selling to minors. But it really does protect people who have been disproportionately arrested, prosecuted, and convicted it protects them from being excluded from the industry, which is what we saw before. And this, Section 4A4, really is kind of the crown jewel of the initiative, in my opinion, because it is the piece that talks about what this industry has the opportunity to do to help us to make sure that we are a part of this new economic boom that's coming to Massachusetts, and to make sure that our communities are benefiting from it, since our communities are the ones that have been harmed by it for so long. And in order to get these 3 lines in, there was a lot of work that went behind getting these 3 little lines in. And the first thing is that Shalene and I went and pulled in community leaders like Horace, other business leaders, law professors, and we really took this idea, brought it to the law school, worked on coming up with language that would really be a hook to ensure and make it so that nobody could, that these issues cannot be pushed to the side, that this would have to be something that was addressed when this industry came here to Massachusetts. And so within the initiative, if you look at Section 4A4, it requires the Cannabis Control Commission to promulgate procedures and policies that promote and encourage full participation in this industry by people that are from communities that have been previously disproportionately harmed, and to positively impact those communities. So it's 2 different pieces, making sure that we're part and participate and have opportunities within this industry, and that also that our communities are positively impacted. So this right here is really what our opportunity is, and now the question becomes, what do we make of this? And really that answer lies within this room and beyond, because it's what all of us decide that we're going to do and how hard we're going to push to make sure that this actually means something in the new law. Personal protections within the initiative are that people in Massachusetts have the right to possess and use. They have the right to possess up to 1 ounce of cannabis outside the home. You're allowed to possess up to 10 ounces inside the home, except 9 of those ounces have to be under lock and key. Just kind of interesting, considering you could have like a whole garage full of alcohol and no worries there. But if it's cannabis, it has to be under lock and key. And it's an interesting question is what happens if you have like 2 ounces outside of the home, right? What if you have more than 1 ounce outside of the home? And actually what happens is if you have between 1 ounce and 2 ounce, you're back in that decriminalization area where you could get a ticket, or again, if you're black, charged. So, be careful about that. And after 2 ounces, you're really just back in criminal zone. So just be aware that this doesn't change any of the other criminal penalties for cannabis. It just carves out this very specific legal area for people to have it. People also have the right to grow cannabis. They have the right to grow 6 plants for each adult, total of 12 plants in a household. And the question at the bottom is, does everybody get to grow? And the answer is no. Everybody doesn't get to grow. Your landlord can prevent you from growing. So only people that own their own homes have that right to grow. If you live in public housing, you do not have the right to grow. And so that is kind of a qualified right there, but it is the right that people have to grow and possess up to 6 plants in their residence. That is the social justice and the freedom piece of it. What about the commercial side, the business opportunity piece? So the regulation of the regulating industry agency will be the Cannabis Control Commission. That was a really important part when we were drafting. People would not have signed off to this initiative if it was going to be the Department of Public Health again. They showed themselves to be not a very good partner when it came to implementation, and so it was important for us to come up with an entirely new agency that would then control this. And so the initiative says that it's 3 people that will be this Cannabis Control Commission, 3 commissioners, and they will be appointed by the treasurer. And then there will actually be a second advisory group that will be made up of experts, and it says that they need to be experts in all different things, cultivation, social justice. There's a delineated, there's a list of what types of expertise that there has to be on this board, and they will be appointed by the governor. And the Cannabis Control Commission would then be in charge of writing all the regulations for the industry, accepting, reviewing the applications, and the law lays out 4 different types of licenses that will be available when it comes time. The first is a cultivation license, so that would be people that are actually just growing the plant. Then the second is a processor license, so that would be somebody who then takes that plant and turns it into something, whether it's an edible, whether it's a topical, whether it's a concentrate, whether it's turning it into a pre-roll, just anything that is processing that cannabis after it's cultivated. Then you'll have the storefront or the retail facilities. So that would be a place that sold cannabis, perhaps a cannabis cafe, which are also allowed under the law. And then the last one is the testing facility. It's important to note that testing facility is its own category. The idea, and it will be the case in Massachusetts, everything will have to be tested. And so there will be a lot of testing laboratories around. So it's a great opportunity for people who are interested in science. So the most important thing that we included in the initiative was making sure the application fees and licensing fees were actually reasonable for people and would allow people, small businesses, people of color to be able to afford them. So under the new initiative, the application fee, instead of $30,000 that we saw in medical, it can't be more than $3,000. And total licensing fee can't be more than $15,000. So still some money, but certainly more reasonable and something that your average business person would be able to raise funds for and pay. And as I mentioned before, prior cannabis convictions can't disqualify you unless it involved sale to them. So the time frame in the law, we set a very, very tight time frame in the law because we saw what happened with medical. It took years and years and everybody just ignored all the deadlines. So there was a really tight time frame, and dates were originally set for early spring. So the dates were the treasurer having to pick those 3 commissioners, and the advisory board having to be picked. All of that was supposed to be done by now. But the legislature really quickly, after we passed the initiative, pushed everything back by 6 months. So now we have those dates pushed back to the summer and early 2018 when it comes to picking the commissioners and then coming out with the regulations and accepting licenses. And not only did the legislature push it back, but they also expressed an intent to change the law in some way. Now, this is the biggest important date that's coming up. Here's just a little bit of timeline of the important things. So right now what we're doing is we're waiting to see what this joint committee, so a joint committee was put together to look at and determine and make suggestions to the governor about what should be changed in this law. And as of the date the bills were due, I think that there were over 37 different bills that had been introduced in order to change the laws that I mentioned. Some of them would take that possession amount down from 10 ounces all the way down to 2 ounces. Some of them would raise the taxes on the material. Some of them would even change that Cannabis Control Commission and make it 5 members instead of 3 members. So right now we're just waiting for this June deadline of what's being suggested to the governor, and then that's going to be a very critical time if there are any things that are suggested that would harm that provision that I talked to you about, 4A4. That really is going to be the time for us to come forward and say no, and make that really grassroots effort to kill any problem bills that come up. Then, after we get past that point of settling the law with the legislature, then in fall 2017, you'll see that Cannabis Control Commission develop regulations and license application. It's also going to be critical that we get our say in who gets on that Cannabis Control Commission. So that's something we've already started working at, identifying people that would be warriors for social justice and equity to make sure that the provisions and generally the spirit of the law is enforced. And then again, in late 2017, early 2018, you'll start to see these applications for adult use licenses begin. And I'll tell you, there are people already that are coming into the state. There are also people who are working on teams and building. There's not a ton of stuff to do right now except get the expertise, start to find the partners that you'd like to work with if you are interested in getting these licenses. And we'll talk a little bit about some resources for that in a bit. So again, the hot topics that the legislature is looking to change are the grow and possession limits, the powers of the cities and towns to opt out, and this equity piece is very big too. So we went and we sat down with the treasurer's office, and the deputy treasurers were very clear that the treasurer really was committed to section 4A4, and they told us specifically that she wanted to weave it into every aspect of the new law, which was great to hear. So the problem is that under the legislature, they're trying to potentially take that power away from the treasurer. I think that would be a real mistake because I think we have an ally in her office and wanting to implement this equity piece. So some of these things, you'll see, they just really remain up in air. We have passed legalization, but there still really is so much to be done. And again, a lot of that is going to be based on who's going to show up when it's time for us to go to the State House to say that we want to make sure that these things become a reality. But I wanted to move into the different kind of challenges and opportunities that exist on the business side, because I know that's what a lot of people are interested in. So there are two different sides to the industry. There are businesses that actually touch the plant, so that's the term of art that's used in the industry. And what touch the plant means is that you have a business that actually cultivates or processes or sells marijuana, whether that's on the medical side or the adult use side. If you actually touch the plant in your business, and it involves sale or processing of the plant. And so any business that's on the touch the plant side is going to be subject to some kind of licensing requirements. And frankly, whatever somebody's doing under the touch the plant side is going to be illegal under federal law. It doesn't matter what state law says, you're still going to be illegal under federal law. So there are a lot of issues that come along with that, a lot of risk that still comes along with that. It's getting better as kind of more and more states legalize, but until the federal government really changes and moves, you are engaging in federally illegal activity at that point. It tends to also require a very long licensing process like the ones we just discussed. But at the end of the day, if you do get a license and you are cultivating, I mean, there's definitely a lot of money in that industry and a lot of opportunity. And so I think that you're going to see, despite the fact that we had a lot of problems with the medical side, I think if we do all band together, the adult use side is going to really flourish and have a lot of different opportunities for people who do want to actually touch the plant. The other side of the industry are ancillary businesses, and believe it or not, this is the bulk of the industry. The majority of businesses that are in the cannabis industry don't actually touch that plant because there is so much more beyond that needs to support and goes into actually creating the plant and different products. So the types of ancillary businesses are products that help people use their cannabis or increase efficiency either on the industrial side or on the patient side. So my device, my product, the decarboxylator, would fall into this category. It's a patient product and device. It's something that people who touch the plant, like this is a popcorn edibles company out in California that uses our device to activate their material and then make popcorn that's sold in dispensaries. And so there are many, many different products, not just a patient device like mine, but things like software systems, things like general products and services that are supporting these other cannabis businesses. So you're talking about anything from your regular traditional professions that actually would never actually have to turn into a cannabis whatever, but could just serve cannabis clients like accountants. All cannabis facilities, cultivation facilities, or retail facilities, they all need security. They all need customer service. They all need consultants when it comes to all of the different aspects of business. One thing I've noticed in the cannabis industry is while people in the cannabis industry have a real knowledge and ability about the plant oftentimes, what they lack is other general business skills. And so people within the industry always need kind of your traditional, anything that you would need in a traditional business applies to the cannabis business. Marketing service, printing services, just all of the things that you might not even think about that go into a business are needed in the cannabis industry. There's also a huge need for educators and salespeople. In the cannabis industry, when you have a business that's up and running, a dispensary, or even a business like mine that's an ancillary business, what you find is it's very, very difficult to find customers sometimes because you're not allowed to advertise in the way that other people are. For example, dispensary can't put out an advertisement about their business. And so people that have access to audiences that can then pull those audiences into places, pull them into dispensaries, or even teach them about different products, those people make a ton of money, first of all, like out in California. And I think that they'll be a huge part of the industry here, those kind of people that bridge the gap between the service providers and the people that are looking for those services. And then, you know, people often think of cannabis, the cannabis industry, as a, you know, just people wanting to grow and touch the plant. But the cannabis industry is actually very a cutting edge industry when it comes to science, when it comes to chemistry, when it comes to even programming. For example, when you have a dispensary, you have to have these protocols in that track every single plant from when it's a seedling until when you sell it. And so those requirements have led to people developing lots of different software and computer technology in order to support this industry. So anybody who, I guess my point is, whatever your skill or expertise is, it could be lent to the cannabis industry. And that's a great way to get into the industry, is just using the skill that you have to support a business. Because what you'll realize is the industry is very small, and you can learn the different parts of the business that you don't know very quickly, but you'll find that people really need skilled workers and partners and consultants to help them through the process. I think that there are a couple of different things that we can think about how we can make a difference in this space, and it really does come back to the two different pieces, which is civil rights and freedom and then economic justice. We need to make sure that when this law is implemented, that we are vocal in demanding police training, so that we don't see the disparities that we saw in medical, or we don't see the disparities that we still see in Colorado continue here, and that people in our community are treated the same in other communities when it comes down to the way that we are policed and the way that we are treated around cannabis. Another big issue is expungement, right? People now are going to be walking around with criminal records for activity that's legal, and they're going to still be punished for that. So there's a big movement towards expungement and pushing for expungement. And I think that's something that should be at the top of our minds as we're making demands of the legislature and the CCC. We also need people to know their rights, and I think this kind of forum is the first step, because a lot of people aren't aware of what their rights are when it comes to cannabis, how much they can possess, how much they can't, and just being armed with that information keeps you from being put in a situation. For example, when I was arrested at the police office, and being able to come up with the legal argument of my civil rights being violated because I'm being arrested for less than a decriminalized amount, it's important for people to know and be able to avoid charges if police aren't properly trained. Also, I think that a defense fund for people of color one thing we found is that sometimes professionals of color are really wary of entering the cannabis space, because it's hard enough here in Boston for us to become successful and get opportunities, that after, why would you want to put that at risk when you're more likely to be targeted if you are a person of color going into the industry? So the idea of kind of a defense fund has been thrown around. And then the last piece is really medical access, making sure that our communities know about using cannabis for medical purposes, and that we're bringing more of that information and more of those situations into our community. And I think that's a huge business opportunity as well, because when you think about the fact, yes, you can't sell cannabis right now unless you have a license, but you can give it away. You can gift up to an ounce to another adult, and you certainly can teach about it. You can educate people about it. You can teach people how to exercise their own right to use it. And there's a huge gap that exists right now. Even if you go into a dispensary, there's not a lot of patient education. So people who have that knowledge and that ability can really make a difference for people's health. And I think that's a huge opportunity. And then on the economic side, the business side, we have to make sure that when the Cannabis Control Commission comes out with those regulations, that those regulations are addressing those requirements for equal participation, that those regulations are actually giving back to our community. But what does that mean to us? What does positively impact our communities mean? Because I'll tell you something, the Cannabis Control Commission is not going to come up with those ideas on their own. They need us to come to them with those ideas. And that's why I'm so excited to see so many people here today, because I want to push this to you as community members. What does positively impact our communities mean? There's a lot of money that's going to be coming back into the state from these taxes, and we have an opportunity to say, hey, we want some of that money going into these particular places. When we were working with Northeastern Law School, they actually, a law office of students took up this issue of what this provision that I showed you before could actually mean. And they came up with some really great suggestions, and I would love to share that report with everybody so you can take a look at it and give us your thoughts about what would be the best. And some of those things that they thought up were co-ops for cultivations and dispensaries. So groups of community members can get together and have these licenses. Grant programs. Money is a huge issue. I'll tell you, when I was raising money for my own business, the average startup that is founded by a white man gets $1.6 million in funding, and that's a failed startup, one that will eventually fail. Where you have a black woman business, the average successful one raises only $36,000. So when you're talking about capital and access to capital, you do need money to start a business in the cannabis industry. And you do run into challenges when it comes to banking and other things that just challenges for the cannabis industry. So those challenges are exacerbated when you're a person of color and you don't have access to the capital that you need. So I think that a grant program, or we cannot look to the government for this, but there's starting to be a lot of interest in a private fund that would then serve entrepreneurs of color. And what we need is more entrepreneurs to come forward and say, yes, I need this, because there is a huge opportunity, again, if we're showing that interest and we're there on the forefront demanding it. We also talked about, the Northeastern report also talked about residency requirements. The requirement in places and communities of color that the people have to be from those communities that are owning businesses in those communities. I mean, it seems pretty simple and like common sense, and I think it would make a huge difference, because you have a lot of people from out of state who have their eyes on our state. They see what's going to happen here, and believe me, they're not going to be giving back to it like people that are from here. And so this residency requirement, I think, would be good for our communities and honestly the rest of Massachusetts. Industry training as well, getting people prepared and qualified for jobs in this community, and then also youth empowerment and education. So these are the areas where there really is, we're really building this from the ground up. We have Union of Minority Neighborhood support. We've also started this group called EON, which is Equitable Opportunities Now. So this is the group that is laser focused on making sure that Section 4A4 comes to light. And so I would love for you guys to sign up for the EON mailing list so that we can all keep in touch and that we can get your really important feedback about what would make the difference in our communities and what would make the difference for you personally in your journey into the cannabis industry and having a business or a career in the industry. So these are just a few resources that I wanted everybody to know about. So Equitable Opportunities Now really is a grassroots group of activists, community organizers, academics, community leaders, nonprofits. We're really interested in not only making sure that people have business opportunities, but making sure that this money that's coming back is going into our communities. So if you guys know of any nonprofits that are looking for money, looking for funding, we really want to be starting to pair these businesses up, starting to demand from dispensaries that they're supporting our groups. Another group that is at the forefront is Massachusetts Recreational Consumer Council. What I really like about this group is they're focused on the recreational side of things, but the founders are people of color. And they are really dedicated to the equity piece as well, and they're lobbying all the time down at the State House, and they're really doing great work. MPP is Marijuana Policy Project. I mentioned them before. They're just the national group. Go to MPP if you're kind of interested in looking at like overall what's happening in the nation. They're not really, we've done what we need to do here in Massachusetts, but the MPP is more of a national resource. Mass Can Normal is the local advocacy group. You can definitely go and take a look at them. Northeast Cannabis Coalition, I co-founded this group, Northeast Cannabis Coalition. We are a group of business owners who are focused on making sure that local people and local businesses have opportunities. So if you have a business in the cannabis space or you want to be a business owner in the space, please connect and look up Northeast Cannabis Coalition. We have a big event coming up in June called Startup High, where we'll have a ton. Last year we held it, there were over 100 investors and entrepreneurs there pitching their businesses and just networking. And so Startup High will be happening on June 8th. And then Cannabis Society is a great social group to belong to. They have very, very upscale events. They have Toasty Tuesday at the Liquid Art Bar, and they have a lot of different, really, like I said, nice upscale events where you can go meet other people who are in the industry, and I highly suggest that for women and even men. Women Grow Boston, you can find them on Facebook as well. Then, if you're interested in getting into the industry, I definitely would suggest checking out a national event. MJ Business Daily, they host very large conferences. There's actually one next week I'm going to in DC. High Times has lots of different cannabis cups. The next one is in June, but it's a great, out in Santa Rosa. It's a great place to kind of see what other businesses are. There's actually one coming in September to Rhode Island, so that would be a great one to catch, to see local businesses. There's also a group called Cannabis World Congress and Business Expo in June. They will be down in New York, so that would be a good one to catch that's really close. And then New England Cannabis Convention, they actually just had a convention in April, but they're having, another one, and they have them in Providence as well. But these are just kind of some resources for folks if you're interested in kind of delving deeper. But please do follow us on Facebook. What we're doing at EON right now is we're putting together a cheat sheet for our officials of color so that they know what to support and not to support. We're also putting together a cheat sheet for individual community members in order to be able to reach out to their reps, in order to just be able to reach out to their neighbors about the importance of this. And honestly, it is going to, there probably only be 1 or 2 times that we're gonna need people to kind of show up, at these hearings or at these events. And all it's gonna take is one room full of people. They don't see that down at the State House, you know? And so if we're able to go and show them that this is not something that's going to be ignored, I know that we can really get opportunity here. And I think that's what everybody's looking for, is just for it to be a fair a fair industry that allows people to use their talents and develop solutions that will help the broader community.
Starting to develop that and think about who will be standing there. What type of persons or like people are you thinking that will make that 3-member body? And then my second question is, and I'm not sure if this has already kind of been, if this has been sorted out yet, or if this is in the process, but what are the regulations around transportation?
So the first question, we don't know who's going to be on the Cannabis Control Commission. What we do know is that since the law passed, there have been over, I think, 20 people that have reached out on their own trying to submit their resumes to be part of the Cannabis Control Commission. And it's been everybody from probation officers to lawyers to people who helped write the initiative to people who are completely opposed to the initiative. But I think that the type of person that they're looking for this initiative, and this is what we heard from the Treasurer's Office, are obviously people that have experience with implementing state law, people that have, you're talking about really, really experienced people when it comes down to running agencies, developing programs. So you're talking about people with government experience. On our side, we've suggested, we've gotten a couple of people on a very short list. One of those folks is Judge Leslie Harris, who, in our opinion, would be perfect for the Cannabis Control Commission. He was a judge for over 20 years, obviously very familiar with all of the laws in the Commonwealth and implementing those laws, but then also with a social justice background. So I'm thinking that you're going to see people who are, very experienced and very skilled in some of these different areas. And I think there's going to be a lot of drama over who gets on that Cannabis Control Commission. I think we're going to see that, and we need to be ready with our demands of the type of people that we want to see on the commission. But that those people are really going to be holding all the power in their hands when it comes down to writing these regulations. And then the second question about transportation is, yes, so while the regulations have not, we'll have to wait for the Cannabis Control Commission to promulgate those regulations, but we can look at what they've done for medical. And I think that all the medical regulations are definitely going to be the jumping point and the starting point for the adult use. And so if you look at the medical, transportation of large amounts is allowed between the dispensary sites, but there's lots of different regulations about how that has to happen. Number one, 2 people have to be in the vehicle at all times when they're transporting, and it has to be weighed and videotaped before it leaves the facility, and then weighed and videotaped when it gets to the next facility. And so there are all these different the rules that are in place on the medical side to prevent loss or leakage. So also too, when you're transporting on the medical side, you actually have to use randomized routes. You have to have a vehicle that's non-marked. So you can't take the same route every single time. So there are a lot of things that are put in place, and I think we'll see that on the adult use side when it comes down to transportation as well.
I have 2 questions, and both of them, one of them is tax allocations, and one is civil.
Yep.
So first, the tax allocation, I understand the CCC will be being implemented in fall 2017.
Yeah.
But as an activist, one of the questions would be one of the funds that will be used, hopefully if the initiatives do get passed, or bills get passed, any of those funding will be helping people that are already incarcerated or in due process to be incarcerated that are non-violent cannabis possession charges. And the second one is for activism, seeing how we have to be a voice in the State of House for June, what would be like some type of resources that you would tell students or anybody in the community to start being active from now till June to be a voice for the industry?
Right now, the way the taxes are allocated is you'll have their basic state tax that goes right back into the general fund. Then you'll have an additional, I believe it's 6.7% tax on top of that will go back into the general fund too. So no earmarks as of yet for anything, especially not earmark. Everybody, everybody not in our communities wants all that money to go back into police, education, schools, all of that stuff. Then in addition to those two taxes, the local city or town can put up to 2% tax on the cannabis, and that money goes right back to that city or town. And so I think that there are two different places where we can push for some of that money to come to our communities in lots of for whatever we decide that it's for, including helping folks that are still being kind of caught in the system. And I think at that point, obviously, we try to get those cases dismissed and whatnot. And there are actually a lot of groups here, I'm sure you're probably involved with some of them, that are working towards that, that we're working on the Annie Dukin drug scandal case and getting those cases dismissed as well. And I think those groups will kind of converge with ours on these particular issues. And I think that's one of the most important things that people can begin to do, which is being aware of these cannabis issues as they're working on their other social justice issues, because again, there's going to be a time where we all just need to show up. And so having people aware and ready, I think that's the most important thing at this point. And also participating when, hey, as Eon, we say, hey, we're having a planning session of what do people need, because we really need people to, right now, we have a small group. Yes, it's us that help pass the initiative, but we can't make all the decisions on behalf of what the community needs. We need everybody within the community to say, hey, what do we want to demand from the state here? And so I think that we need to start doing that now, over the next couple of months, so that when the Cannabis Control Commission holds their first hearing, we are showing up, we have a list of demands and a whole line of people behind us, demanding that it happens.
Have there been any discussions that you're aware of regarding licenses for marijuana use? Just the reason I thought about that is, driving is a privilege. So once you reach a certain age, you can apply for a driver's license, and then, your ability to drive is regulated by laws and all this other different things. You violate the law while driving, suspensions and those kind of things. So has there been discussion regarding that? And also, what are the considerations versus effectiveness of applying these new laws versus the costs on hindrance with regulation by having more regulation with the authorities?
Yes, there's more regulation, but you're taking millions and millions of transactions equaling billions of dollars from an unregulated market where there's no tax revenue from them, and you're pulling them into the legal market, so you're actually generating a ton of revenue. And you're not, if police are trained correctly, you're saving a lot of money from the people that you're not prosecuting and pushing through court. So definitely legalization is, economically makes sense, because it pours millions and millions of dollars. I mean, when you look at California and Colorado, you're talking about, Colorado and Oregon, you're talking about $150 million in taxes every year going back to the state. So that's money that has never been realized before and isn't realized right now under the current, enforcement scheme. And again, it costs us money as taxpayers to jail people and to arrest people. When it comes down to use of cannabis, I think the goal is to restrict, to make cannabis in line with the other substances that we as adults are able to use. So if you're talking about alcohol and the fact that you can go and buy as much as you want, we wouldn't want to put restrictions on cannabis that weren't equal to restrictions on alcohol. We also know that any restrictions on cannabis are used against minorities and people of color, like we know that. So we want to try to keep it as, just the age, you're over 21, you're allowed to. And we really patterned it after alcohol, which is you're over 21, now you meet that status. And it seems like that at least is a framework that makes sense to people.